been fractured into over 160 pieces for 200 years and no complete reconstruction has ever been funded. And number 1 on this list, the Amduat of Thutmose III, sat sealed in a tomb for 3,400 years. When it was finally opened and translated in the early 20th century, the full version was placed into restricted academic access. What it describes inside the tomb is what we will get to at the end. Stay for all 7. Because the final text is not a mystery. It has been translated. It has been read. And the people who read it decided, within years of the discovery, that it should not be widely distributed. Number 7. The Edwin Smith Papyrus. Egypt, circa 1600 BC. Acquired in Luxor, 1862. The document is named after the man who bought it, not the man who wrote it. The actual author is unknown. The style of the handwriting suggests it is a copy and that the original source text is older. Possibly much older. One analysis of the vocabulary places certain phrases in an archaic form of Egyptian that predates 1600 BC by several centuries. The papyrus is 4.5 meters long. It contains 48 surgical cases, organized from head to foot, the same organizational principle used in modern medical textbooks. Each case follows the same structure: title, examination, diagnosis, verdict, treatment. The same format used in clinical documentation today. Case 1 is a scalp wound. Case 7 is a depressed skull fracture. Case 22 is a compound fracture of the temporal bone. Each case describes not just what to do but what to observe before deciding: pulse, breathing, the movement of the eyes, the behavior of the patient. Case 47 deals with a spinal injury causing paralysis of the lower limbs. The text notes that this is a condition that cannot be treated. It does not attribute the paralysis to spiritual interference or an imbalance of humors. It attributes it to damage to the vertebrae, a mechanistic, anatomical diagnosis written 3,600 years ago. The surgical instruments referenced include the knife, the fire drill for cauterization, and what translators have described as a metal probe. None of these are described in a ritual context. They are clinical instruments used in clinical procedures. Edwin Smith bought this document in 1862. He kept it private. He died in 1906 without publishing a translation. His daughter donated it to the New York Historical Society that same year. An Egyptologist named James Henry Breasted published the first full translation in 1930, 68 years after acquisition. During those 68 years, surgery had rediscovered antiseptic technique, developed modern anesthesia, and performed the first successful appendectomy. All of that happened without knowledge of a text that described surgical procedure in clinical detail 3.5 millennia earlier. What would medicine have looked like if this text had been shared in 1862? We cannot know. What we know is that it was not. And the reason was never formally explained. Number 6. The Turin Erotic Papyrus. Egypt, New Kingdom, around 1150 BC. Acquired from Deir el-Medina, approximately 1820. This papyrus was found at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village on the west bank of Luxor, where the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived for generations. These were not ordinary laborers. These were the men whose professional work includes the finest painted ceilings in any burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings. The papyrus arrived at the Egyptian Museum in Turin in the early 19th century. It has been in that collection for roughly 200 years. It was not publicly displayed until 2006. The document is divided into 2 sections. The first shows anthropomorphic animals playing musical instruments and riding chariots, a common form of New Kingdom satire. The second section shows 12 explicit vignettes, drawn with the same level of technical skill as the official tomb paintings across the Nile. What is significant is not the content itself. Erotic imagery exists across every ancient culture. What is significant is who made it and where it was found. This was produced by the royal tomb builders at their professional peak. This is not crude graffiti scratched into a wall. This is deliberate fine art, created by trained craftsmen who spent their professional lives painting the afterlife. The question the museum has not answered publicly is what the second section documents. Some researchers argue it is ritualistic, connected to rites associated with Min, the god of fertility and royal succession. Others argue it records a practice within the temple system that later religious reframing required to be suppressed. What the museum stated, its official position for nearly 2 centuries, is that the papyrus was inappropriate for public display. A document produced by the most skilled artisans in ancient Egypt, depicting a scene from their world, locked in storage for 200 years. The reason was aesthetics. The material, whatever it actually documents about New Kingdom Egypt, was managed by treating it as embarrassing rather than historical. Number 5. The Westcar Papyrus. Egypt, the original events dated circa 2500 BC. The physical document dates to around 1600 BC. The papyrus is named after Henry Westcar, a British traveler who acquired it in Egypt around 1823. It is now in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. The text consists of stories told at the court of Pharaoh Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Each story describes a great magician performing an impossible act. In the first, a magician named Jajamank folds back an entire half of a lake to retrieve a piece of jewelry from the bottom, then restores the lake to its original state. In the second, a magician creates a wax crocodile, speaks a word over it, and it becomes a living animal 7 cubits long, approximately 3.5 meters, which seizes a man and drags him underwater for 7 days. When retrieved, it becomes wax again. In the third, a magician decapitates a live goose, allows the severed head to move across the floor, reattaches it, and speaks a word that restores the bird to life. These events were categorized by Egyptologists as fiction, as folklore, as mythological narrative. But here is what is not fiction. The framing of the document is historical, not mythological. The pharaohs mentioned, Khufu, Sneferu, are real. The settings are real courts and real palaces. The organizational structure of the text is identical to the structure used in administrative records of the same period. The document does not read like the Book of the Dead or the pyramid texts. It reads like a historical account that contains events modern readers cannot accept as factual. The word translated as magic, Heka in Egyptian, does not mean illusion. In Egyptian theology, Heka is a force, a mechanism, the power by which the universe was created and is maintained. The practitioners described in the Westcar Papyrus are not performing tricks. They are described as applying Heka as a technical skill. The document was acquired in 1823, translated in the late 19th century, and categorized as fiction within the first decade of scholarly analysis. That categorization has not changed. It was not sealed in a vault. It was sealed in a classification fiction that ensures it will never be examined as historical evidence. That is a more efficient form of suppression than a locked door. A locked door can be opened. A category cannot. Number 4. The Ipuwer Papyrus. Egypt, original events disputed estimated between 2000 and 1700 BC. The physical document dates to approximately 1250 BC. The papyrus is a lament, a genre of Egyptian literature describing a period of catastrophic collapse. The speaker, Ipuwer, addresses either the pharaoh or a god, cataloging what has happened to Egypt. The text contains the following: the river is blood. Men drink of it. And all animals weep. Cattle moan because of the state of the land. And trees are destroyed. No fruit. And plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. This language is almost identical to the plagues described in the Book of Exodus. When the connection was first observed in the early 20th century, the scholarly response was to adjust the dating of the Ipuwer Papyrus. If the events it describes cannot be placed in a period that overlaps with the Exodus timeline, the parallel ceases to be evidence. The dating of the original events has been revised multiple times since then. The physical document has been in the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden since 1828. The first full scholarly analysis was published in 1909 by Sir Alan Gardiner. In his own notes, Gardiner directly acknowledged the parallel with Exodus. He then spent decades arguing that the dating made the parallel coincidental. The papyrus has been continuously available to scholars for nearly 200 years. The translation is not disputed. The language is not disputed. What is disputed is what the language refers to, and that dispute has been managed by repeatedly revising the date rather than examining the content. If the Ipuwer Papyrus describes real events, and those events overlap with the Exodus timeline, then the absence of Egyptian records acknowledging a catastrophic loss of the Hebrew population is not an absence of documentation. It is a choice about what to record. Egypt did not record its defeats. That is documented separately. The text told the story. The dating was adjusted 3 times to prevent the story from fitting. Number 3. The Turin King List. Egypt, approximately 1200 BC. Acquired 1820. Now in the Egyptian Museum of Turin. When Bernardino Dravetti shipped a collection of Egyptian antiquities to Turin in 1820, the papyrus was in relatively good condition, largely intact. By the time it reached the museum, it had been fragmented during transport. The Turin King List is the most complete known list of Egyptian pharaohs from the earliest dynasties through the New Kingdom. It was written in hieratic script during the reign of Ramesses II and includes over 300 entries, names, reign links, regional notes. But the first section of the document is not about the pharaohs we know. The opening column of the King List contains a pre-dynastic register, a list of rulers before the first dynasty, before the pyramids, before anything that appears in standard Egyptian chronology. The reign lengths in this column are measured in thousands of years. Individual rulers are assigned lengths such as 24,000 years, 36,000 years. The total tally, before the dynasties begin, runs to tens of thousands of years of rule. The interpretation that prevailed is that this section is mythological, that it describes gods and demigods whose reigns are not historical claims but religious convention. But there is a problem with that interpretation. The Turin King List is not a religious document. It was compiled by a state bureaucracy for administrative purposes to establish royal succession, validate the legitimacy of current rulers, and document the continuity of the state. The sections referring to known historical pharaohs are precise, consistent, and structurally identical to other administrative records of the same period. The pre-dynastic section uses the same structure, the same notation, the same format. If the authors intended the opening column to be mythological, they chose to write it in exactly the same way they wrote the historical record. That choice has not been explained. And then there is the physical condition of the document. The papyrus arrived in Turin in approximately 160 fragments. The reconstruction has been ongoing since the 19th century. A complete, funded, digitally integrated reconstruction of all fragments has never been finished. This is a document in a major museum in a major European city. The technology to scan, map, and reconstruct all 160 fragments has existed for decades. The project has not been completed. What the pre-dynastic column of the Turin King List actually records in full, what a completed reconstruction might reveal, remains, formally, unknown. Number 2. Papyrus Harris I, Egypt, approximately 1150 BC. Acquired near Luxor, around 1855. Now in the British Museum. This is the longest papyrus in the world. 40 meters of continuous text, written shortly after the death of Ramesses III, the last of the great warrior pharaohs. It was commissioned by his son, Ramesses IV, and documents the reign of his father, temple donations, construction projects, military campaigns, and administrative records. Anthony Charles Harris acquired it in 1855. It was donated to the British Museum in 1872, where it has remained for over 150 years. For most of that time, it was studied primarily as an administrative record. What it also contains, at the end of the document, after the major listings, is a description of a conspiracy. A plot inside the royal harem to assassinate Ramesses III, place a lesser prince on the throne, and seize control of the succession. The conspiracy is described. The names of the participants are given. The text states that the conspiracy was uncovered, the conspirators were brought to trial, and punishments were issued. But Ramesses III's personal survival is not explicitly confirmed in the text. The The document moves from the conspiracy account back into administrative records without a clear statement about the pharaoh's fate. In 2012, a CT scan was performed on the mummy of Ramesses III at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The scan revealed a deep cut across the throat, a wound concealed beneath the mummification linen, healed over during the embalming process. The cut was consistent with a blade wound severe enough to sever the trachea and major vessels of the neck. Ramesses III was murdered. The conspiracy described in the Harris Papyrus succeeded. The papyrus documenting that conspiracy had been sitting in the British Museum since 1872. The document that recorded how the most powerful man in the ancient world was killed by his own household was translated, published, and available. The mummy was in a museum in Cairo. 140 years passed between the acquisition of the document and the CT scan that confirmed what it described. That gap is not explained by lack of access. It is not explained by lack of technology. The technology to perform CT scanning on a mummy became available decades before 2012. The text said it happened. No one checked the body until 140 years later. Number 1. The Amduat. The complete version, found in the tomb of Thutmose III. Valley of the Kings, Egypt. Sealed approximately 1425 BC. Opened 1898. The Amduat, translated as "that which is in the afterlife," is the oldest complete religious text in the world. The most complete surviving version was sealed inside the burial chamber of Thutmose III for 3,400 years. The tomb was opened in 1898. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in the complete Amduat, painted in a deliberately simplified form, using stick figures and dense cursive hieroglyphs, as if the scribe was recording as much information as possible in the available space, in a format that could be read in conditions of poor light. The translation was completed in the early 20th century. It describes 12 hours, each one a stage of a journey through a specific underworld domain. Each domain has a name, a geography, a population of beings, and a defined set of events that occur there. Here is the problem that has not been resolved. The Amduat does not read like mythology. The descriptions of the 12 hours include directional coordinates, north, south, specified depths, and spatial relationships between different domains that imply a consistent, mapped geography. The beings cataloged in each domain are described by type, function, and individual name. The language is technical and systematic rather than narrative and symbolic. Researchers beginning in the 20th century and continuing into the 21st have proposed that the Amduat is a map of a physical location. Not a metaphor for the night sky. Not a symbol for spiritual transformation. A map of chambers, passages, and levels in a structure or network of structures that no longer exists at the surface. The full critical edition of the Amduat from Thutmose's tomb was not published until 1994. Translation work had begun in the 1900s. The complete scholarly edition took 75 years to appear. And the section describing the deepest point, the final chamber, the 12th hour, the place from which Re emerges into daylight, contains a set of spatial descriptions that have no confirmed corresponding location. Researchers have proposed sites beneath the Giza Plateau, beneath Saqqara, beneath the Valley of the Kings itself. None of these proposals have resulted in excavation permits. The ancient Egyptians placed the most complete map of what is in the afterlife inside the tomb of their greatest military pharaoh, sealed it for 34 centuries, and when it was opened, translated, and read, the destination it describes cannot be found. That is not mythology. That is a coordinate without a confirmed location. Subscribe. Because this is what we do here, not speculation, not entertainment. We read the primary texts. We look at what they actually say. We ask why the answer isn't in the history books. And we come back every week, because there are more texts like these, and this is nowhere near the end. 7 texts. All translated. All documented. All currently held in museums or archives that are accessible to credentialed researchers. A surgical manual hidden for 75 years while surgery reinvented itself without it. An explicit document produced by the finest craftsmen in Egypt, locked in storage for 2 centuries on grounds of aesthetics. A text describing impossible procedures, categorized as fiction without explaining why its structure is identical to verified administrative records. A lament whose language mirrors the Exodus narrative, whose dating has been revised 3 times to prevent the parallel from holding. A king list whose opening section assigns reign lengths of tens of thousands of years in the same format used for confirmed historical records, still unfinished in reconstruction after 200 years. A 40-meter administrative document containing an assassination account confirmed by CT scan 140 years after the text was first available. And a map of the afterlife, sealed for 3,400 years, describing a destination that no excavation permit has ever allowed anyone to search for. These were not lost. They were not destroyed. They were found, translated, and managed through classification, restricted access, delayed publication, or simply by moving the date. If something here changed the way you see it, share this. Not because we have the final answer, but because the final answer requires more people asking the question. Subscribe. One of these every week. We are not done.